Hemispheric lateralization and split brain research. So, what is meant by hemispheric lateralization? So, it's the idea that the two halves of the brain, the two hemispheres, function differently from each other, and they are certain mental processes and behaviours are controlled by one hemisphere rather than the other. So, for example, language centres are in the left hemisphere rather than the right. So Broca found that damage to the Broca's area in the left hemisphere led to language deficits, whereas damage to the equivalent in the right hemisphere didn't. So left side is responsible for language. So if we're to look at that a little bit more, so you might have heard of this idea that left brain or right brain. So left brain tends to be analytical, logic, language, science and maths, whereas right brain tends to be more creative, art, music. So left dominant for speech and language, right is specialises in visuomotor tasks. And the two hemispheres are connected by a bundle of nerves. So they are the corpus callosum, and they allow information to transmit to one another. The connection means that you're still able to talk about things that are perceived by the right hemisphere. So, for example, remember, information that enters the left visual field is processed by the right hemisphere, but obviously that information then has to transfer across to the left in order for the language centres to be able to discuss what they have seen. Now, key research into split brain patients. Now, to treat severe epilepsy and to end seizures, sometimes that bundle of nerves had to be cut. So they cut the corpus callosum. So therefore there was no way for the two hemispheres to communicate with one another. So split brain research. They studied split brain patients that had the corpus callosum cut. They presented visual information either to the left visual field or the right visual field, and then participants had to respond verbally what they had seen or use one of their hands to either pick an object that they'd seen or draw what they had seen. So they found that if a picture was shown in the left visual field, information would be processed by the right hemisphere. The patient couldn't verbally say what they had seen because there was no language centre on the right side, and obviously that information is unable to reach the left hemisphere due to the corpus callosum being cut. If the picture was shown to the right visual field, the patient could easily describe what they had seen. Remember, right visual field is processed by the left hemisphere, therefore language centres in the left side of the brain, they could say what they had seen. Interesting enough, if they were shown a picture in their left visual field and they were asked to respond by drawing the object or picking the object, they could do so. Because remember, left visual field processed by the right side of the brain, the motor cortex of the right hemisphere will allow them to pick up or draw what they had seen. Now, conclusions from this was there's differences between the two hemispheres. There's key differences. The left tends to be responsible for speech and language, and the right specialised in visual spatial processing and facial recognition. So, split brain patients show unusual behaviour when tested in experiments. Briefly explain how unusual behaviour in split brain patients could be tested in an experiment. So, you'd briefly say that you could present information to the left visual field and ask them if they could see what they had say what they'd seen, or you could present information with them to the left visual field and ask if they could draw or pick what they had seen. So in terms of evaluation, we have contradictory evidence. So language sometimes doesn't seem to be restricted to just the left hemisphere. So this goes against the idea that the left deals with language and speech. Right-handed people generally develop their language centres in the left hemisphere, but left-handed people may have them on either side, so on the right side, or they might have it in both. So this goes against the whole idea that one hemisphere is responsible for a certain behaviour. Usefulness, so this is quite an interesting study. So there might be actually advantages of having lateralization. So one hemisphere being able to do one task and the other hemisphere being responsible for the other. So Rogers et al. Found that in domestic chickens, lateralization was associated with the ability to perform two tasks at the same time. So they could find food and also be vigilant for predators. So the usefulness, it clearly is advantageous to have this lateralization of the brain. In terms of testability, so a strength of split brain research is that it involves highly specialised and standardised procedures. So that both increases the internal validity, as it was a well-controlled procedure, can control extraneous variables, therefore we can establish cause and effect, but it also increases the reliability because we can replicate the studies in future. However, there is difficulty in generalising the findings. Studies have only used a few participants, and these patients may have had an underlying physical disorder in the first place. So the fact that they'd had seizures and they were extreme seizures through epilepsy could have caused other disorders to their brains or to other regions to be damaged, we don't know. Also, there may have been some nerve fibres still intact, still remaining, so there might have been still information being transmitted across, we don't know. So in terms of evaluation-based questions, briefly evaluate research using split brain patients in terms of hemispheric lateralization. So that idea that standardized procedures, lab controlled setting increases internal validity, increases reliability, or you could go down the route that small sample size, hard to generalize to a non-clinical population. Some of the nerve fibers of the corpus callosum could still be intact. And then outline and evaluate research into hemispheric lateralization. So your outline would be your idea that what hemispheric lateralization is, so one hemisphere being dominant for a certain task over another. Then the idea of what the left generally is meant to be dominant in, so left is meant to be language and speech, whereas right is visuospatial tasks, and information is transmitted across both hemispheres to one another via the corpus callosum. Then I would mention my second AO1 paragraph on that key research into split brain patients and how they had damage to had severe epilepsy, so they had to cut the corpus callosum, and then the task they did, so information being presented to the different visual fields. Could they say what they'd seen, yes or no, and why? So remember, left visual field is processed by the right hemisphere, no language centre in the right hemisphere, can't transfer that information across to the left hemisphere because that bundle of nerves is gone, so they couldn't say what they'd seen. Right hemisphere, fine. Right hemisphere, right visual field is fine, processed by the left. They can say what they've seen because the left hemisphere has lateralization, has the language centre. Interesting enough, take it one step further. Say if they were presented information by the left eye, they could pick the object that they had seen, or they could draw the object they had seen, because the motor cortex was responsible for that movement. They could pick, but they just couldn't say what they had seen. Conclusions that each side is responsible for different actions. Then evaluate this research as a whole. So is there supporting evidence? Is there contradictory evidence? Other explanations? Is it useful and is it testable?